Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. On behalf of the Urban League, I want to thank our speakers tonight and everyone that will be here listening and asking questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Isabel Escobar to talk about our speakers and our subject. So thank you, Isabel, our intern. As well, I also want to thank Sadia Barge, our Director of Interns at the Jacksonville Urban League Center.
Hello everyone. My name is Isabel. Like a little bit about me. I'm currently a student here at UC Berkeley. I put together this town hall along with working with the Jacksonville Urban League as an intern. And I am excited to talk to our guests about their experiences working in different sectors within immigration in the US. So we'll go into our first speaker. Our first speaker is Re-becca Sharpless. So Re-becca Sharpless is a professor who is a leading immigration law scholar and advocate known for combining rigorous legal analysis with human rights advocacy. As the founding director of the Immigration Clinic, she trains students to represent non-citizens in deportation and appellate cases while engaging in impact litigation. And her research explores the intersection of immigration and criminal law, emphasizing how hierarchies of race, class, and criminalization marginalize certain immigrant groups. And she also challenges reform narratives that contrast the model immigrants with those who have criminal convictions instead of proposing approaches informed by racial and class critiques of the US justice system. And she's also a finalist of the author for Reader's Choice Book Award of the book Shackled, 92 Refugees in Prison on the ICE Air that came out recently in 2024. I want to thank you for coming out and like for being able to do this town hall, and I'll get already started with the questions. My first question that I have for you. So again, I want to thank you for your time. The first question is, so much of your work challenges that the idea of immigration should be treated through the same lens as criminal law, given how today's political climate often ties immigration to national security. And I wanted to start by asking the first question, with immigration increasingly framed as a security issue, what risks do you see in allowing criminal logic to dominate migration enforcement?
Thank you, Isabel, and thanks to everyone who came out tonight. And I'm happy to be here. I should mention that I used to bring my students to near Jacksonville. We used to fly into Jacksonville Airport to go to the Baker County Jail, which is about 45 minutes away from where you are. And you may know is a place where they are holding hundreds of people in immigration detention. And we would do Know Your Rights presentations and explain to people about their rights and screen their cases. But now there's actually a even bigger, I think, detention center also in Baker County that has very terrible conditions, no air conditioning, that was just started, and the Trump administration calls it Deportation Depot. So you all are very much in our minds as we're thinking about the consequences of being in the state of Florida under the Trump administration. And it's really great that Jacksonville Urban League is holding this conversation. I think it's really terrific. So yes, I do a lot of thinking about the intersection of our immigration justice system and our criminal justice system. Most of the clients that my clinic students represent in court sit at the intersection of those two systems. And so we really do try to focus our work there. One thing I'll say is that in very many ways, people facing deportation are criminalized and treated as if they were in the criminal justice system, but without the protections that they would have if they were in the criminal justice system. I think people are shocked to know that You don't have a right to a free lawyer, even if you're facing permanent banishment in the deportation system, in the same way that you would in the criminal justice system. It's easier to get out on bond or just get released in the criminal justice system, much easier than it is to get released, particularly today in the immigration system. In the last months, the agency in charge of interpreting the law has come down with some decisions that essentially make it impossible to get out on bond if someone has entered the country without inspection, regardless of any criminal record. And so what that means is that once a person is ensnared in the deportation system, it becomes very difficult to defend oneself and pursue remedies because one can't get out of detention. And the conditions there have never been great, but have gone from bad to worse. I'll share that just yesterday, actually, I was at the Everglades jail, the tent jail that the Trump administration calls Alligator Alcatraz. And I spoke with a man who was shackled for 13 days to a bed in the medical unit there. So they're very dehumanizing things that are happening in the detention centers. We had another client who was shackled for hours and put in a small cage in the sun as punishment. We have another client who had his foot broken by officers at that jail. So the situation with what's happening in detention is very, very, very dire. And it really is, I see a ramped up approach to treating people here who have overstayed their visas or done something else. It's a civil infraction, but they're being treated like they're in the criminal justice system and in many ways worse and without the protections that one would get if one was in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very scary times, especially since we're trying to since like many people are trying to navigate like either like if like they immigrated here or even people on visas, it's been like honestly really scary, especially since like people like personally to me like whether they're undocumented or like whether they're also on visas, it's like kind of that's like very, very scary to me as like yeah, as well. And then I guess like I'll go on like to the second question, like kind of what you talked about like connects directly to your research and how like enforcement systems are shaped by like kind of like deeper inequalities and also like building on that. If you were to bring like racial and class critiques more directly into immigration reforms, like how might that change directly of the policy? I guess I'll just go like more indirectly to the question, like how can you incorporate race and class critiques of criminal justice system to reshape the immigration reform efforts going forward?
Yeah, and I think it's important to continue to think positively about the future and to try to still fight for a vision of the world that is positive and inclusive. Um, and so one dynamic, of course, is in trying to reform immigration law and ask for better treatment for immigrants, is to try to avoid what we call the good, bad immigrant narrative. To say, oh, well, they're not criminals, so they should be treating well, making a distinction between immigrants who might have criminal convictions or criminal justice history and those who do not. And I think it's extremely important to bring a racial justice perspective to that kind of narrative and see how it actually is unhelpful and inaccurate. And I think in the racial critique of the criminal justice system has made progress, I think, in that regard. I think books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow have popularized the downsides to demonizing people with criminal records and have shown how really, if you look at our prison system, it's highly racialized and it reflects the history of racism in this country, including the legacy of slavery. And so it's really important. I think we've learned that lesson, or at least some of the American public has learned that lesson in the criminal justice system, but hasn't really imported that lens and way of thinking about things in the immigration space. And so you continue today, even among advocates, to hear a lot of rhetoric around good immigrants, and we shouldn't be deporting them because they're good. And that's still, I think, very deeply problematic. I see why people want to slip into that rhetoric because it's easy and it is a way of combating President Trump's attempts to paint all immigrants as having criminal convictions, which isn't true. And in fact, immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, have a lower percentage of engagement in the criminal justice system. So I see why people want to engage in those distinctions, but it is, in terms of moving things in the right direction, it's something that we want to try to avoid, I think.
Thank you so much. And then I guess I'll go into kind of like our third question. And then I might ask some following questions like based on your like kind of answers. But going to like the third question, you've written powerfully about like kind of like these systems that don't just operate in theory, they impact like real people in devastating ways. Specifically in your book, Shackled, you document the experiences of 92 Somali refugees, which this kind of brings to life. And would you be able to share their story and reveals about how race and money intersect in today's kind of immigration system?
Sure, and I have the book right here.
Mhm.
Um, it's a what we call narrative nonfiction book. So what that means, it's written. I tried to write it like a novel in a very engaging way, so you sort of move along quickly. It's not academic writing. It's a true story of a group of 92 men and women who were shackled for 2 days on a failed deportation flight. One day of that time was spent on the tarmac in Senegal before the plane had to turn around and come back to the United States, where they landed in Miami, and my clinic and other groups learned of their situation and intervened, and were able to shed light on what had happened to them. Because in addition to being shackled, they were abused, they were denied bathrooms, they were verbally abused, some of them were physically abused. And it was a very devastating situation. And again, the whole time they were shackled and immobilized in seats in the plane. And what we did is we intervened. We filed a class action lawsuit arguing that they shouldn't be just immediately turned around and put back on the plane, but should be given an opportunity to reopen their individual immigration cases. And then we got the judge to stay the plane going back, to give them an opportunity to do that. We got pro bono lawyers for people who wanted to try to stay and fight their case. We got 2/3 of the cases of the people who wanted to try to fight reopened, and got many of those people out of detention. Not everyone. So the story is told through the eyes of two individuals on the flight, two men, one of whom had been here as a refugee since he was a child, had a criminal record and was being deported. The other was somebody who was a first-time asylum seeker who'd never been at liberty in the United States, and had a very good claim for asylum, but had been denied and had kept trying to fight his case. And interwoven into all of that is our stories about shackling, the use of shackling. It's the same company that made the shackles that they were wearing as had made shackles for the US slavery industry. It tells the story of private prisons and the big money that's behind these private jets that charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to shackle Black men and women and deport them to Africa. It tells the story of the prisons and how much they make per day, per person, to hold people in immigration detention. And it also tells the story of Somalia, including Somalia's civil war, which is incredibly violent. And it tells the stories of personal resilience of these two men and what they went through. One of the men was in a Kenyan refugee camp for many years and witnessed the murder of his father. So they're two very compelling, I think, personal stories interwoven with what happened on the plane, interwoven with history, but also lawsuits. The book attempts to teach readers about what it means to file a federal lawsuit. It's really for people who are thinking about law school or people who are in law school who want to know a little bit about what it might mean to be a social justice lawyer as well.
Thank you so much. And I guess like another question I have is especially like on the terms of race. Why do you think that they were why do you think that they were treated like more why do you think that they were treated more like criminals? Do you think it was truly kind of based on like race, or was it because of kind of like a little bit of the criminal background, even though that they were refugees?
So not everybody on the plane had a criminal background. Some did, some didn't. And part of the book is to make the reader identify with both of the protagonists in the book, even though one has a criminal record and one does not. Those of you who read the book, and I hope you will, can tell me if you did feel connection in the same way with both of the characters. I think you will. Um, so the United States now has an across the board shackling policy for everyone who is transported by immigration. Doesn't matter if you're pregnant, doesn't matter if you're going to a medical appointment, it doesn't matter if there's no reason to think you're a danger to anyone when you're being transported. So now everyone is shackled. Um, what was extraordinary here is the length of the shackling and the fact that when something went wrong and it ended up being a crew rest problem, that they got stuck on that tarmac because the relief crew hadn't gotten enough rest and couldn't fly. So that's why they got stuck. But there was no high level diplomatic intervention to come in and come up with a plan so that people could be unshackled, so that they could have a break from where they were, so they could be more comfortable, walk around. I absolutely believe that if they had been white Europeans on that flight, there would have been some sort of high level diplomatic intervention. But because they were poor Black, mostly men, I think it was not, the problem was not seen as as one requiring elevation to a higher diplomat. And so that's what happened. I will say that there is a special code when I did public records requests and uncovered a lot of these flights for mainly Black African men. They use special ops officers for those flights because they presume that because it's Black men on the flights that they're going to be violent, even though there's no reason to think that. So what happens is these special ops officers, even before someone has done anything and no one was doing anything, they put people in masks. They have an overwhelming show of force. They have straitjackets that they show people before they get on the flight, and they actually deployed some of them. They deployed one actually against an asylum seeker on this flight. So they have this overwhelming show of force because they work from the presumption that because they're Black men, that they're going to present some sort of a problem, which of course is not true. So I absolutely think that race absolutely played a part in what happened.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you again for coming here to speak, especially like as a person who is kind of like more on the legal side of this and being able to offer that kind of experience. So I just want to thank you so much for coming to speak, and thank you for answering all my questions.
Sure. And I'm also happy to stay on if people have particular immigration questions, because I know that there's a lot of information out there and people are scared, and they're scared of being stopped and being questioned. And if people end up spending even a night in jail, that could be a pipeline to deportation. So I'm also happy to answer questions.
I was wondering if anyone has any questions. If not, we could also like keep going on. Um, till the end to see if anyone has any questions. Does anyone have any questions at this time? Okay, I see like Dennis, you have a question?
Yes, I see that you and I have some common ground in that I worked at Catholic Legal Services for immigrants some time back. And I was wondering if you could compare what it was like back then when you were doing that work and what it's like now in your immigration clinic.
I mean, and I've almost always worked with people who are detained. It has never been easy, and there have always been abuses. And what happened with the men on this plane that I wrote about in the book, that was in 2017. But what I can say is today is just at a whole different level, both in terms of how many people we're seeing in detention. It's doubled. Instead of 30,000 people being detained at any given moment, it's 60,000. No discretion is being used to not detain people or not deport people. Um, People are being picked up, being sent to third countries, countries that they don't have any connection with. They're just being put up in the middle of the night on planes and sent away. The courts are sometimes sympathetic in issuing orders. Sometimes the government is following them, sometimes not. And when the orders go up to the higher courts, they're not enforcing them. Um, and the conditions, I talked about a little bit about some of the things that have happened to clients of ours. The conditions are beyond anything I've ever seen. I never used to see, for example, people being shackled in buses overnight because there's no bed for them in the detention center. Normally, what would have happened is they would have just said, "We don't have space, so release the person." But now what's happening is people are shackled, maybe put in a bus, or they're meant to sleep on the processing floor, the processing room floor at Chrome Detention Center, to the point that there's not even enough space on the floor for people to sleep. So it's really extraordinary. And then combining that with the fact that almost no one is eligible to get out on bond, um, it's just it's extraordinary. The difference between even the difference between Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0 is massive. I think they planned for 4 years how to ramp up immigration enforcement and just be brutal. I call it like a scorched earth approach to immigration enforcement.
Thank you so much for
And
that.
just one comment. I mean, the potential number of individuals that could be subject to this is well over 10 million. I mean, and you talk about running out of space. It's almost, if they continue to stay in power and continue to do what they do, the number of people that could be devastatingly impacted is very high.
And everyone's families. It's not just the
Exactly.
individuals
Yeah,
themselves, but it's all
yeah,
their community, their families, their children in particular. Yeah.
yeah. I ran some numbers on it. It's like 1 in 5 individuals in this country will be impacted by this.
Well, thank you so much for your response, and thank you also for the question. I was wondering if anyone else has any questions before we move on to the next speaker. Okay, seeing there's none, we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and talking. Thank you so much. And then, okay, then we'll move on to our next speaker. I want to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker, her name is Nanci Palacios. Hopefully I said that correctly. She is the organizing and membership director at the Detention Watch Ne-twork, where she leads national strategies to end immigration detention and build the power of directly impact communities. And with over a decade of experience in organizing across immigrant, undocumented Black and queer communities, Nanci brings both lived experience and strategic vision to fight for justice. Originally, she's from Mexico and raised in Central Florida, and Nanci's journey as a formerly undocumented immigrant fuels her deep commitment to dismantling the detention and deportation system. She has played a key role in statewide victories like securing HC tuition for undocumented students and advancing local campaigns to reduce the harm of immigration enforcement. So we thank you so much for coming to speak. And then I guess I'll get into the questions, unless if like you have anything else to say. Um, if not, then I'll go into the questions.
No, you can go ahead. Thank you. Well,
Okay,
thanks
perfect.
for having me today, and I'm glad that everyone's here and we'll be able to learn together and you'll get a little sense of what's going on in the community.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I guess we'll begin with the first question. So the kind of first question I have for you, like how has like the national conversation around immigration changed since you kind of first began organizing, and what worries or inspires you about the kind of shift that we see today?
Yes, thank you, Isabel. And once again, thank you everyone for being on today. So, as Isabel was sharing, I started organizing back in 2010, 2011. And when I first started organizing in that time, the national conversation around immigration was centered on youth-led stories. I grew up in the Dreamer movement where we were loud and proud, and it was okay to say I'm undocumented and I'm afraid. We would actually encourage it, and you weren't worried that someone was going to detain you. And it growing during that time, the organizing was happening with the Dreamers. It was young, undocumented leaders, especially in Florida, who were leading the way across the country. During that time, there was a growing moral call for dignity and legislation. We were actually pushing for immigration reform, and there was a huge walk of four dreamers who left Miami and walked all the way to DC, and that was kind of like the big launch of what was happening at that time. At that moment, there was a sense that if we shared our stories, we could shift the hearts and minds, and in many ways, like we did, right? DACA is an organizing victory. And for those of you that don't know what DACA is, it is a protection for many youth and many now adults that came as youth that allows them to be here legally, that allows for them to be protected and not deported, and allows them to work. And that transformed our lives and the way that we were able to show up in our communities. Today, the landscape is very different. The conversation that we're having has become much more polarized and punitive. As the previous speaker was sharing, states are increasingly stepping into immigration national debates. Their states are also like at the front lines of enforcement. A lot of the times, in the past, immigration, and still is, right, a federal issue, but it was only uh, enforced through a national lens, and the way that funding was going into detention through a national lens. Now, as states are increasingly stepping into this immigration enforcement pathway, there's also more harmful narratives about crime and danger, as it was shared earlier, that are shaping the debate. When in reality, we believe at Detention Watch that it doesn't matter what your background is, you should not be held in detention, right? And you should not be taken away from your communities. What worries me the most is how normalized criminalization has become, how quickly elected officials use fear to justify the detention and deportation, and the attack on basic rights that people are undergoing right now in every one of our communities. And at the same time that all this is going on, I'm also deeply inspired. I see directly impacted leaders back in 2011 and now, especially like young people and people who are in mixed status families today, who can be the most outspoken, be very present, and be strategic and show up rooted in the community power today, just like they did in the past, but even more so now because they're risking a lot. And it's not just a form of reaction to what is happening. They're building long-term strategies, they're challenging the detention systems, and they're refusing to let politicians define their humanity. And that resilience gives me a lot of hope. I think right now, a prime example is here in Central Florida. We've seen a lot of over policing happening in communities where work cars, trucks, construction vehicles are getting randomly pulled over. And randomly, right, in theory, because they're out stopping cars that look like it's people who may have one or more people in the car. And communities have stood up. Like there's a particular community in Central Florida that the sons and daughters of people who may be undocumented are out protesting and saying like, you're not welcome in our communities. You can't be coming here undercover and just harassing our communities. And so even though the shift of the narrative has changed, the people who were fighting at the forefront has shifted. People have still continued throughout the years to stand up, even if the fight has shifted a little bit.
Thank you so much. I know it's interesting to see how like kind of like the narrative has like kind of changed, especially since like before like there was like a glimpse of hope of like for undocumented students, especially since like so many of the legislation that has been kind of proposed like almost offered pathways but never got passed. And it's interesting to see kind of like the shift today to a more conservative type place where it makes people kind of scared to even be outside. But then luckily there's like places that like especially like with the organization that you work for who still tries to advocate like kind of for those communities, and I just want to thank you for that. And so I guess like I'll go into the second question. So kind of like several states are expanding local cooperation with ICE while others are limiting it. So how is Detention Watch Network adapting to those kind of contradictory policy trends?
Thank you for that question. So we're operating in a landscape where states are moving in opposite directions at the same time. Some are doubling down and collaborating with ICE at a local level. They're passing laws that are forcing local agencies to assist in detention and deportation, like Florida, for example, where there's been over the last, I would say, 5 years, have really passed a lot of anti-immigrant. Not only rhetoric has enforced, like has been used, but laws have been passed to force the local collaboration. We operate a lot of our campaigns to end what is called 287G agreements. And that is the intergovernmental agreements that local agencies have to make to be able to do enforcement because it's a federal issue. And at the same time that all of this is happening in states in the South, Texas is doing this, Florida is doing this, Alabama, Georgia, right? And it's rapidly expanding. And also in the Midwest, like there's been a rapid expansion of detention centers in those areas. There are other states that are creating protections. They're limiting local involvement. They're actively reducing ICE's footprint in their states, like Chicago, which doesn't have a detention center. And that is actually one of the reasons why their detention numbers have been down. And, a lot of the times families will say, well, we don't want a detention center to be completely out of our communities because at least we'll have our families close by. But the reality is that the amount of people detained will only increase if you have a detention center in your community. If you get rid of a detention center in your community, the numbers of people who can be detained will drastically drop and they won't have anywhere to put them, right? And so DWN adapts by staying anchored in what the community wants and the analysis that the community has, and really the strength of the community and the different connections that they have, because some states are more better prepared to fight back because they've been doing it for years, while other states, for example, the detention center in their communities is new, so they're like pretty much starting from scratch. We look at what's happening state by state and kind of adjust our strategies accordingly in places where, for example, cooperation with ICE is expanding. We will support the local organizers with like rapid response strategies. We also can assist them with like legal and policy research and also with national amplification, given that a lot of the things that are happening at the local level is a blueprint for what could happen in other areas. And so folks can really connect with other people and understand and learn what is the landscape that they're facing so that they can better prepare for expansion in their areas. And, the whole point is that we can make sure that people don't feel like they're fighting alone because there's so many intersections to what is happening. Now, there are states that are, like I said, are limiting ICE's reach. And for places where that is happening, they're introducing legislation to limit like local collaboration. They are both at the local level and at the statewide level. We have seen places like California pass legislation like the HEAL Act, which pretty much says, let's create an alternative economy to detention. We can't keep putting our tax dollars into detention when you have people who don't have access to healthcare, when they don't have access to education, when they don't have access to everyday necessities. We have to stop extracting these resources from community, and policy like that has helped shape those states that are more friendly and have been more supportive of immigrant communities. And, throughout the country, we have two types of fights. We have both um, anti-expansion fights. So this is when we learn that there's a site that has been open, and, we help to try to stop it by looking at all the permits that they have, making sure that they're not cutting corners to open up facilities, and create just the support that folks may need locally. I apologize, I'm getting over a cold. That folks have the support that they need locally to actually stop the expansion from growing, while at the same time building our capacity to push back. Because what we have seen is that a lot of the local anti-expansion fights have moved quickly to a shutdown campaign because sites have opened really quickly. And the funding is there. Earlier this year, there was billions of dollars that were passed to be able to fund, right? And that is part of why the beds that are currently being filled are over 60,000 at this current time. And while we're doing all of this, our role is just to make sure that we're connecting local fights to a national strategy, making sure that even in contradictory environments, that the movement is moving towards the same long-term goal, which is ending immigration detention altogether and shutting down every detention center and freeing everyone who's currently detained.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, so sorry. I hope you like feel better. But yeah, thank you so much for talking about that. It's kind of like crazy how kind of the detention centers like have been expanding, and how that you try to even abolish them, especially since like they're like coming up so quickly. So thank you guys like kind of for being able to do that work despite despite it kind of like being funded, and it's hard to, I guess, get away from right now from like the Trump administration. But I guess giving like quickly like or given how like quickly the policies can shift from one place to another, I also kind of also want to bring to like the third question. I want to bring this down to like more community level and talk about the people most affected by these changes. So kind of like my final question is, how do current anti-immigration narratives and state level laws directly impact like the organizers that are like on the ground?
Thank you so much for that question, because I think a lot of times we forget about how hard doing this work is, right? It's really gratifying to get up every day and do this work and knowing that you're fighting for change, but it's also really exhausting. And especially today, right? A lot of organizers are at the intersections of both being directly impacted and their families being impacted and potentially having to respond to something that's happening to their family at home, but then also responding to a community, right? And they're seeing it every single day. Um, but as I was saying around the narratives and what is happening in our communities, the narratives and the laws that are currently really leading, right, what is happening in this country create real fear. They create a lot of fear towards the people and hostility towards directly impacted people, but it also creates a lot of fear from the people who are receiving these attacks. And at the same time, because of that, there's also a lot of urgency around responding to this moment. Directly impacted organizers are currently facing increased surveillance. We saw this earlier in the year as many, directly impacted organizers were very outspoken around, for example, Palestine, and they were targeted, right? And they were taken into detention, and they have been, many of them, being residents are being stripped of their status or questioning of their status. There's also been a lot of policing and constant threat of detention to people who usually have been very vocal around their status. People I've seen be a lot less vocal around their status, or just like their stories, because they may have family members who are still directly impacted and they don't want to trigger any kind of attention to themselves or their families. And I think also looking at state level laws that have empowered sheriffs or local police to act like ICE intensifies that fear in the community, especially for people who have already had to navigate racial profiling and criminalization in the past. And, what often gets overlooked is the emotional and psychological impact on organizers who are having to respond to what is happening. They are holding the community trauma, very close while still having to show up and fight and keep going and having to create strategy to push forward a fight, right, that can create change in the communities. They're doing the leadership work, while also having to worry about their families in this moment. And, at the same time, these attacks strengthen the organizers' commitments. They know what's at stake, they know what's the worst that can happen. And they also are connected nationally with other organizers in other areas that are seeing, right, change happen because they keep organizing. So they get inspired by other people, and it kind of helps them not feel alone around what is happening. So because a lot of organizers tend to be directly impacted, they also can bring more moral clarity and live experiences to the table to create strategies that are effective. And no policy brief, none of that can replace that lived experience that people have. But they do need our support. We have to make sure that if you're not directly impacted, first you listen, right, and make sure that we're following the lead of the organizers on the ground, and that we are in solidarity and stand up to also as allies in this moment, because they have a lot to lose and they really need our support to be more vocal, to create a space where they can share resources, where they can create like a plan around safety when they're going out and doing actions, or when they're being vocal around what is happening, creating a space for them so that they can have like a mental health, like reflective, healing space to kind of like let go of everything that they're hearing in their communities. And at the same time, organizational infrastructure, that kind of supports them in case there's any risk that they may undergo while they're out trying to do these campaigns to stop detention facilities, because you're really going up against a big system that's being heavily funded right now. And, as people are doing different campaigns locally, we really need to make sure that we open up, our offices, our spaces that may be needed, right, to make sure that people can meet at least in a safe place. Um, but those are all ways that I see, right, that folks have been kind of impacted more recently. A lot of people are really scared around what could happen to them, but a lot of organizers also think that the risk of not taking action is actually greater. And as long as people are connected and surrounded by individuals that care deeply about them and that are going to stand in solidarity with them, they're willing to push forward, because there's no other way. They don't see any way out but to organize and create power locally.
That makes sense. And I just want to ask, like, just like a very small question. Also, like, working like with the organization they currently work with, like, what's like the most rewarding part, like you would say, of working with them?
I think the fact that we're able to connect with people who are just looking to be um kind of steered in the direction to fight for their community. A lot of the times people don't take action because they don't know where to begin. And so we are able to create bridges for people to connect with each other, but at the same time create a safe space for people to kind of unload, right? All the baggage that they have from just having to like carry all that trauma that the community has and really connect with each other. And then be connected with other people that are having similar fights as they have and that they don't feel alone in these fights. Um, Part of the work that I get to do every day is talk to people who are fighting this at the local level, strategize with them, think around alternative tactics that may happen, maybe created in their communities that they just maybe haven't tapped into, making those connections with like faith leaders who are looking to be more vocal and kind of take, a stand around what is happening. I get to do that every day, and so do my colleagues, right? And at the same time, we help them with tools and resources. That sometimes is the gap in their organizing, or it's the gap in them being able to actually move forth a campaign that's going to create change and stop detention and deportation in their communities.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking. And then I'll open it up to anyone if they have any questions. But if not, then I guess we can move on like to the closing statements. Does anyone have any questions?
I did have a question, and I do want to say first and foremost, thank you to not only you, Nancy, but also to both of our speakers, Becky as well. So I personally don't honestly, I can't say that I know anyone that is undocumented or anything of that sort, but as someone in the community, say for instance, who wants to be an ally, to provide support or something like that, how could just a normal individual, like just sitting here, like don't know too much, how can just a normal community member get involved, help, be an ally, or do something meaningful for immigrants and for this fight?
I can start us off. I mean, unfortunately, right now the hate and rhetoric towards immigrants is very public. So I think like an easy way is to like not condone any kind of public violence and opinion that might come towards someone. That's something that's low hanging, very easy to do. But I think that just making sure that you're like inclusive, that you're creating safe spaces for people, and then more like policy and like, campaign driven. There's a lot of funding that's currently allocated to enforcement and that will continue to be allocated to enforcement if we allow it. And so a call, an email to your local member of Congress goes a long way, and just telling them, please don't add any more funding to detention, because as long as funding keeps getting put forth for that, the amount of beds that will get funded to hold people will grow. And if the bed amount grows, they will fill it. And it's not because there's just a rapid number growing of undocumented people in this country. No, because they're going to go out and like look for folks, right? And so I think asking and advocating against funding is always a good idea. And if there is a detention center in your community, in Florida, we have several. There's active community campaigns that are happening. In South Florida, there's an active campaign to close the Everglades detention camp. There's vigils that happen there every Sunday. There is also an effort happening now in North Florida in Camp Blanding and the Baker Collect, which didn't end up opening, but they keep organizing in the Baker Detention Center up in the North Florida region. And there's going to be several actions that are happening or organized locally. And if there's any kind of 287G agreements, which, like I said, are the agreements between ICE and your local enforcement, organize your local communities against it. Stand up, rally, show out against it. There'll be a whole bunch of days of action coming out throughout the year. Join, and if anyone plans them in your community, show up. Just show up, right? In every way you can, show up.
I want to say thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here and being able to present. And then I guess that we could go into our final remarks. And then this is the last call. Does anyone have any more questions? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we'll just go into our final remarks. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here and answer like all the questions that I have, also other people have. Thank you so much. And then let's see.
Well, on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League, I did want to thank our speakers this evening. Every time we have a meeting like this, a virtual town hall on immigration, I learn so much more, and I also see the crescendo effect of the current policies and how they're impacting so many people. And the more we can make this information well known, I think the better off this country will be. And I think that was, both of you have been making that point throughout this time. In fact, the amount of information, if you look at the billions of dollars that have been authorized in the last 6 months to immigrant incarceration, essentially, and the amount of people that could be impacted by this, I think a significant number of Americans, once they begin to see these, see these numbers, I think will do the kinds of things you were talking about, Nanci. Will be willing to speak out, and particularly call their local legislators, that is to say municipal, because our municipality has made deals and they're trying to put more policy in our local budget on these issues. And then, of course, our legislature and what they've done. So speaking out, and we really appreciate the work both of you are doing, and also want to express my gratitude to Isabel for putting this together, and Saudia and the rest of our team. I see Daniel Peter, Naisha Harris, also interns at the center. Glad to have you with us tonight.
We
So
also
again,
Bobby, sorry. I just want to make sure that we didn't forget her as well. And then I also did drop in the chat our city's city council website for their numbers and emails if you want to go ahead and start making those calls today, even if you just reach out to one. So I didn't mean to cut you off there, Dennis.
no, thank you, Saudia. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the evening, and look forward to having you back at some point to see where we are in 4 or 5 months.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Everyone.
I'm gonna drop one more link in the chat if you want to send it to folks. It's our sign-on letter to stop expansion, and folks can just sign it and it'll automatically send it to their member of Congress.
Perfect.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
you.